A month ago, the MTA released their 2025 to 2029 capital plan. In the plan were some really solid things, like CBTC, a ton of maintenance projects, accessibility projects, and of course, the IBX. While I do think the MTA should include more like Queenslink and extending the E to Southeast Queens, I am surprised that the MTA is doing this much. Literally 2 capital programs ago, the MTA would have balked at the idea of a circumferential line, and here we are. I do hope to see more of these pleasant surprises in future capital plans. But this video isn't about the New York City subway. This video is about the LIRR, and on that front, it is the polar opposite of the New York City subway, where future plans of the railroad are disappointing at best and non-existent at worst. Now, before I begin, let me say the following. I am not asking the MTA to implement a French-style regional rail system in the 2025 to 2029 capital plan. Nor am I asking the MTA to go do 20 East Side Access projects. That is impossible, and while I do think it should happen eventually, it won't be done overnight. What I am asking is the MTA to utilize the East Side Access to fulfill their promise of better service. So let's start with the 2025 to 2029 capital plan. What is in there that is LIRR related? Well, not much. The first thing is that the MTA is studying electrification from Ronkonkoma to Yaphank. Yeah, you mean electrified Medford and Yaphank, 2 stations that see -10 riders annually. Great use of funds, am I right? Well, I do believe there is an insidious reason as to why the MTA wants to electrify the main line up to Yaphank. Basically, they want to divert as many riders away from the Port Jefferson and Monok branches and funnel them down the Ronkonkoma branch. But Ronkonkoma is pretty far away from the ends of the 2 lines. But Yaphank is past Port Jefferson and Patchogue, which means siphoning riders off of Port Jefferson and Montauk is possible. What I think will happen is that when Medford and Yaphank is electrified, ridership is going to explode, while Port Jefferson and Montauk ridership is either going to stagnate or go down a bit. Then the MTA is going to turn around and say, look at that, ridership is up on the Ronkonkoma branch and down on the Port Jefferson and Montauk branches. So we're going to cut even more service to the 2 aforementioned branches and overserve the Ronkonkoma branch. Then because of service cuts, more riders will take the Ronkonkoma branch, and do you see where I am going with this? Basically, instead of doing the obvious project, which is electrifying the busiest LIRR branch of 2023, the MTA plans to double down on park and rides. What is going on here? But I guess the MTA can't ignore the ridership of the Port Jefferson and Montauk branches, so they also call for so-called improvements to the 2 branches. What they probably mean is that they want to put battery trains on the Port Jefferson and Montauk branches. Come on! Yes, it is an improvement to diesels, but battery trains are still flawed. Namely, they have low energy capacity and the batteries themselves are pretty heavy. Again, the real solution is electrification to both of these branches. But unfortunately, the MTA doesn't look too kindly on Port Jefferson electrification, as they view it as too costly and won't benefit a ton of riders. I will address those claims later. But yeah, that is it. From 2025 to 2029, expect very little change on the LIRR. Now, complaining is very easy. After all, this channel is based on that. What is harder are solutions, and the rest of the video will be dedicated to the projects I think the LIRR should do. However, I do admit that there is a laundry list of things that the LIRR needs to do, which is why I don't want every plan to make it to the next capital plan. Rather, I hope at least 2 or 3 of these plans below make it to the LIRR radar by 2029. Otherwise, we're purposely stunting the growth of the LIRR for no apparent reason. For now, the goals of my LIRR plan are the following. On all branches, except the Greenport and Outer Montauk branch, a train every 10 minutes during peak times. A train every 20 minutes during off-peak times, regional rail within city limits, higher speeds and high reliability, and Phase 1 and 2 of through running per the ETA's report. Every part of this plan will make sure that this happens. Let's start with the first non-negotiable part, track upgrades. The LIRR, like every commuter system, has zoned express. Trains would skip stops to a certain point, then make all local stops. This setup, while pleases suburbanites who live far out of the city, is challenging to run and cuts into capacity. Alon Levy, a few years ago, noticed how commuter rail in New York City runs much slower than other systems in Europe. That is because of the track quality and how trains slowly go through curves. even when the curves can be cleared at much higher speeds. If you fix that, that means trains can go way faster. Like we're talking about a 30 to 40% time reduction here, even when these trains make local stops. This completely flips the zone express model on its head. After all, if you save so much time, then why are you running express trains if you can just make them run local? This makes it far easier to run trains, and can open the door to infill stations without the MTA and suburbanites further down the line flagging it as quote-unquote added travel time for existing customers going through the station. Doing this will be the first step. We unlock both speed and capacity benefits from this, which makes everything else on this list easier. Now onto the second step, regional rail. There are certain LIRR branches that parallel busy corridors. For one, the Port Washington branch. This branch is unique because it is almost the interline from the rest of the LIRR network, which makes it much easier to install the necessary infrastructure for regional rail. Going further, the Port Washington branch actually merged with Amtrak tracks, and we can create a form of through running on the line to New Jersey. Commuter rail capacity is around 24 trains per hour, so taking half of it for 12 trains per hour for Port Washington and the other 12 trains per hour for New Haven would be doable, though you may interfere with Amtrak intercity services. But even if you take just 6 trains per hour for Port Washington, you only need to take 6 trains per hour from the other set of tunnels into Penn Station, or from Grand Central Madison, so it is doable. Anyway, with 12 trains per hour, the Port Washington branch would have half the capacity of the 7, at around 35,000 riders per hour. That will take a serious dent out of the 7, which the 7 can then use to extend much further into College Point and Bayside. Going further, because of the track upgrades, you can even add a few infill stations. Elmhurst for the growing Elmhurst neighborhood, Maspeth for a transfer to the IBX, and maybe a Corona to further decongest the 7. Some of you are going to ask how fare collection is going to work. I think with Omni, we have a golden opportunity. I believe the MTA wants riders to start tapping in and out. And building on that concept, we can do a system where you tap out of a station, and then when you tap out, you are charged whatever the fare is. So if I start in New Jersey and tap out at, say, Port Washington, I pay $8 to $12. However, if I start at Penn Station and tap out at Bayside, I am charged $2.90, as that is within city limits. If someone fails to tap out, they will be charged the maximum. As for transfers to the bus and subway, you simply tap your Omni card again and it counts as a free transfer. I think using the Port Washington branch as a test for regional rail will be successful. With this success, we can implement this model on other lines. And speaking of which, another branch that can be turned into regional rail is the whole Atlantic branch. This branch goes through multiple transit deserts and can serve as an express alternative to the J, though I do want to reopen a few stations, like Woodhaven Junction for a transfer to Queens Link, and Cedar Manor to further serve South Jamaica. Again, even though I am adding stops, the track upgrades will speed up the line so much that you will still end up gaining time into Atlantic Terminal, though this branch is much trickier. Unlike the Port Washington branch, the Atlantic branch on its eastern end is shared by a whole slew of services. This means our Omni system wouldn't be just limited to just one line, but a whole slew of branches. But it is still doable and yields great benefits, so I say, go for it. After the Atlantic branch, we'll expand our Omni system to other lines. Though because these other lines don't have any stops within city limits, this means the fares will be more normal. Speaking of other lines, let's talk about electrification. This has got to be one of the most popular LIRR proposals, and for good reason. In 2023, the Port Jefferson branch was the most used branch in the LIRR, and it is not hard to see why. When 30% of Suffolk County lives near that branch, expect good ridership. However, the line is only electrified up to Huntington, which means riders have to transfer at that station during off-peak hours to continue their trip. And let's just say service past Huntington isn't fast nor reliable. Therefore, electrification will help all electric trains make it to Port Jefferson. This helps increase service levels, which would be a boon to the tens of thousands of riders that use that line. This means less riders would have to drive over to the Ronkonkoma branch, which means less congestion and less pollution within Suffolk County. The typical response I see against this project is that the LIRR needs a bigger yard, the Port Jefferson branch is full of sharp curves, meaning there will be little time savings, and it won't benefit that many riders. and all of them are, well, unfounded. The first one is that just last year, Suffolk County officials transferred a portion of the Lawrence Aviation site to the MTA for a new yard, and it was cheap, costing only $10. The second one is that yes, the Port Jefferson branch has sharp curves, but electric trains can accelerate and decelerate much faster. This means that electrification can see some good time saves. The final objection is from the MTA, and I would buy that, except in their 2025 to 2029 capital program, they are studying electrification from Ronkonkoma to Yaphank of the Greenport branch, a section that sees roughly -10 riders. If the MTA can magically cough up funds to electrify a section that sees -10 riders, then I am pretty sure they can cough up enough funds to electrify the busiest branch in 2023. Just asking for a little bit of consistency here. Anyway, my ideal way of doing this is to do this just like how the LIRR electrified their Ronkonkoma branch 40 years ago. Not only did they electrify the branch because, it is an electrification project, they also bought out property alongside the right-of-way for a future second track project. That should be done for the Port Jefferson branch, as it is foreseeable that the Port Jefferson branch ridership grows and we would need that second track. On the other side of the island is the Monok branch, and just like the Port Jefferson branch, this is in diesel territory. But unlike the Port Jefferson branch, this is a section that isn't as insanely used. Nonetheless, I argue that partial electrification is necessary here. If not Speonk, I recommend Patchogue. This is because the south side of the island is decently packed with housing, and electrification would increase service here massively. This also means that there is less of a need for Montauk riders to drive over to the Ronkonkoma branch and take those trains, freeing up capacity there. I will explain why I want to extend electrification to specifically Speonk later. For now, under a proposed schedule, half of Montauk trains would short turn at Patchogue, as after Patchogue, ridership drops drastically. Even though I trashed this idea, I still do see some value in further electrifying Medford and Yaphank. Medford has a lot of industry around it, while Yaphank has nothing. But that is going to change, as Yaphank is going to be replaced somewhere east. The replacement location is pretty good, with the Brookhaven National Laboratory in the vicinity of the station. As much as I prefer Port Jefferson to be electrified and not this portion, I still see value in this project, which is why it is on this list. Also, very quickly while we're on the Ronkonkoma branch, I think adding Republic and Holtzville should be considered. Both are located near commercial corridors, and I think having a stop here will greatly cut down on car use. The last electrification project on this list is the Oyster Bay branch. Now, this branch isn't as dense and would see less value compared to the other items on this list, but I still think it is still worth it. After all, it passes through the cities of Glen Cove and Oyster Bay, two cities that have a sizable population. So yeah, electrify the branch. With these electrification projects, all 4 of these branches can see improved headways. As I said earlier, a pair of tracks can handle 24 trains per hour, and with 4 branches, that is 6 trains per hour for Oyster Bay, Port Jefferson, Ronkonkoma, and Montauk. This pair of tracks would then feed into Penn Station. Now, there are some branches that are more heavily used than others, so you may need to modify the amount of capacity. But starting off with even 4 trains per hour during peak times is already more than what each branch sees. Now, for the other pair of tracks heading into Grand Central, well, that is for the Hempstead and Babylon branches. Since that is a lot of capacity, we can also add in the Port Washington branch for extra trains, which is where the extra 6 trains per hour is coming from. If you ask me whether this will complicate our regional rail pilots, I don't think so. Grand Central Madison has 4 platforms, and you just pick one to fence off and install the turnstiles. Finally, the West Hempstead, Long Beach, and Far Rockaway branches will be sent down the Atlantic branch, but not to Atlantic Terminal, but to Lower Manhattan. And that segues to our next part, extensions. This is probably one of the more popular LIRR extensions. This is because the Atlantic branch just ends abruptly at Flatbush Avenue. Sure, there are subways here, but they are pretty crowded. Combined with the huge employment center that is the financial district, a 1C ride there would help a lot. However, when you extend the Atlantic branch to the financial district, this opens the door for possibly de-interlining the LIRR. You can already de-interline the LIRR with the east side access, but with the current setup, you will probably anger some riders. Extending the Atlantic branch to Lower Manhattan will be more palpable, as it is located in a densely populated job center where people are going. Therefore, people might accept it and you limit opposition. You can also limit opposition even more if you reconfigure the tracks at Jamaica, so that trains heading into Lower Manhattan can access both sets of tracks going to Midtown. With trains running at 24 trains per hour, by the time they get to Jamaica, the wait is at most 2.5 minutes. This is going to be very expensive, but I think might be worth it. With jobs rebounding, Lower Manhattan is going to see more riders, especially from Long Island. This also opens the door for future through-running operations to New Jersey, utilizing the PATH tunnels. The West Hempstead branch used to extend to Mineola. However, passenger service was cut back to West Hempstead in 1935, and the right-of-way is still there, just asking for an extension back to Mineola. Extending the West Hempstead branch to Mineola would yield positive results for Long Island circumferential transit. After all, the N40 and N41 buses, the two lines that parallel this extension, are the third most used bus in Nassau County, at 4,700 riders annually. But for this to work, the West Hempstead branch needs to be double-tracked, which I believe is doable. Even if it isn't doable, I reckon adding a few passing loops shouldn't be too difficult, especially when some stations look like this. Another thing I propose is the Sag Harbor Branch. Not because I want to build on the model of circumferential transit, it is because I think there is value operation-wise. If you see the diesel territory under this plan, there are only two: East Yaphank to Greenport and Speonk to Montauk. This means that the MTA would have to build two separate yards to house and maintain those diesel trains, which increases the cost. However, by building out the Sag Harbor Branch, you route all diesel trains on the Montauk branch over to East Yaphank, which consolidates operations. This means that you would only need to build one yard and not two. That is the reason why I picked Speonk to be the end of electric service and not Patchogue, because the Sag Harbor Branch doesn't travel to Patchogue. I don't think it is going to be expensive. The right-of-way is already there, and you would only need a single track with no third rail. After all, you aren't running trains for the 7 train, you're running suburban service. The Hempstead and Central Branch used to be connected. This section, the Central Extension, was last used in 1962, after shuttles to Roosevelt Raceway ended. Since then, nothing much has happened. Reactivating the Central Extension would help this area a lot. There's a ton of industry here, plus Hofstra University and Nassau Community College. With east side access, there is capacity to spare, so it won't hurt capacity on other branches. I am putting this at the end because this area isn't as dense as I like it to be, but I still see some potential, which is why it is still on my extensions list. As Alon Levy puts it, for regional rail, it is organization, electronics, then concrete. That is the basis of this plan I created. The organization comes from relatively low-cost track upgrades, which will speed up trips so much that you don't need these elaborate zoned express systems. This helps organize the trains better, which will create better service for everyone. The electronics come from the electrification projects, which again creates faster and reliable service for everyone. Finally, the concrete comes from the LIRR expansion projects. Anyway, this marks the end of this video. What are your thoughts on my selections? Let me know in the comments below. And if you like this video, consider liking and subscribing. And I'll see you in the next video.